Spring 1945, Western Germany. After the successful Operation Plunder and the Allied crossing of the Rhine River in March, American troops were rapidly advancing through German cities devastated by years of bombing. The civilian population faced extreme food shortages as the Reich disintegrated. His empty stomach ached more than his shame. Helmut Krauss walked through the rubble of his former neighborhood, where bakeries once filled the morning air with the aroma of fresh bread. Now only dust and the heavy silence of a dead city remained. It was April 1945, and hunger had turned citizens into shadows wandering through the ruins of the Reich. But that day, something impossible would happen, a gesture that would forever change the perception of who the real enemies were. The Lost War archives reveal how American soldiers surprised German civilians by sharing their bread amid total destruction. The war was ending, but humanity was just beginning to resurface. Frankfurt's streets were a graveyard of concrete and twisted steel, where each of Helmut Krauss's steps echoed like a lament among the wreckage. His worn boots stepped on glass shards that had once been prosperous storefronts, now reduced to sharp fragments reflecting a gray and hopeless sky. The acrid smell of burned wood mixed with the sweet, nauseating odor of things he preferred not to identify, creating an atmosphere of death that seemed to penetrate to the bone. 3 days without eating properly had turned his legs into trembling pillars, but he kept walking, driven by desperate hope of finding something, anything, that could silence his stomach's growls. The war was lost. Everyone knew that. But hunger was a more immediate and cruel enemy than any invading army. At every corner he turned, Helmut encountered faces that mirrored his own despair. Women with hollow-eyed children, elderly men bent under the weight of a defeat that transcended the military. The propaganda that had once promised final victory now sounded like a distant echo of a feverish dream, replaced by the brutal reality of a population abandoned to its own fate. The sound of his footsteps mixed with the low moans of those searching through the rubble for missing family members or any scraps of food that might have survived the bombings. Helmut's calloused hands trembled not just from the cold of the German spring, but from the weakness that malnutrition imposed on his once robust body. He vaguely remembered the taste of rye bread his mother used to prepare on Sundays, a memory that now seemed to belong to another man, in another world, in another time. On the other side of the city, Lieselotte Brandt woke up in a basement improvised as shelter, where the smell of dampness and mold competed with the phantom aroma of meals that existed only in her hungry imagination. Her hands, once delicate and well cared for, were now desperate claws that searched every corner of the hideout for forgotten crumbs or potato scraps that might have escaped previous searches. The rough texture of the stone walls scratched her skin when she leaned against them to stand up, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the emptiness consuming her from within. Widowed for 6 months, since the official notification had arrived informing her of Klaus's death on the Eastern Front, she had learned that the loneliness of loss was less devastating than the loneliness of hunger. The basement's silence was broken only by the constant dripping of water seeping through ceiling cracks, a monotonous melody that marked the hours of her agony. While Lieselotte tried to ignore the cramps twisting her empty stomach, the first sounds of military vehicles began echoing through the city's destroyed streets. The deep rumble of American engines mixed with the noise of tank treads on shattered asphalt, creating a metallic symphony announcing the definitive arrival of the conquerors. For her, as for thousands of other German civilians, that sound represented the end of everything. Not just the war, but any hope that things could ever return to how they were before. Her thin hands clutched the crucifix hanging around her neck, her mother's inheritance, while she whispered prayers that seemed lost in the immensity of despair. The cold texture of metal against her skin was one of the few comforts that remained in a world that had completely crumbled around her. The streets above, Helmut heard the same sounds of approaching American troops and felt his heart race not with fear, but with a strange mixture of relief and resignation. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as demons thirsting for revenge, but in that moment of extreme hunger, even demons seemed preferable to slow death by starvation. He wondered if the invaders would bring food or just more destruction, if they would allow civilians to survive, or if they would apply the brutal justice they perhaps deserved after years of war and suffering caused to other peoples. The cold spring wind carried fragments of burned paper, remnants of official documents and family photographs that flew like dried leaves among the rubble. Each gust also brought particles of dust and ash that scratched his parched throat, reminding him that even the air he breathed carried the weight of destruction. When hunger becomes greater than fear, even enemies can seem like saviors. The roar of the Sherman M4s echoed through the devastated streets, like thunder from a storm that finally brought rain to a thirsty land. But Helmut didn't know if he should hide or go meet the approaching fate. The American tanks advanced slowly down Kaiserstrasse, their treads crushing the debris with a rhythmic and relentless sound that made the ground tremble beneath his stumbling feet. The smell of burned diesel mixed with the persistent aroma of charred wood and pulverized concrete, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to swallow any trace of hope. American soldiers marched alongside the armored vehicles, their clean and well-fed uniforms contrasting brutally with the spectral figures of German civilians who watched them from broken windows and destroyed gates. To Helmut, who hadn't seen a well-nourished man in months, those invaders seemed like giants from another planet, beings from a reality where there was still enough food to keep flesh on bones. As the military column approached his position, Helmut could distinguish the individual faces of the American soldiers, some young, almost teenagers, others veterans with tired eyes that had already seen too much death and destruction. The metallic sound of their equipment clinking with each step created a strange soundtrack for that moment of silent surrender, while the smell of new leather from their boots and belts mixed with the more familiar odors of urban devastation. Contrary to all expectations created by propaganda, those men didn't look like demons thirsting for revenge, but tired soldiers who just wanted to finish a war that had already gone on too long. Helmut noticed that some of them looked around with expressions of shock and pity, as if the city's total destruction surprised them even after years of combat. The rough texture of the wall he leaned against reminded him that this reality was true, not a feverish dream caused by hunger. In the improvised basement, Lieselot heard the sounds of occupation, with her heart beating so hard, it seemed to want to jump from her malnourished chest. The noise of heavy boots on the rubble filtered through the ceiling cracks, mixed with voices speaking English, a language she partially understood due to lessons she'd taken in her youth, in a time when she still believed the world was a safe and predictable place. Her hands trembled as she held a rusty kitchen knife, not as a weapon, but as a last symbol of dignity in the face of the unknown approaching. The basement's damp smell seemed more intense now, mixed with cold sweat from fear and the acidity of bile rising in her empty throat. She wondered if the Americans would come down there, if they would discover her hiding place, if they would treat her as an enemy or as a human being. The irregular texture of the floor stones hurt her knees when she knelt to pray, but the physical pain was welcome, compared to the torture of uncertainty. Outside, Sergeant William Harris walked among his men, observing the destruction with a mixture of military satisfaction and human pity that surprised him. A veteran of Normandy and the Ardennes, he had already witnessed devastated cities, but Frankfurt presented a level of destruction that touched something deep in his Kansas farmer's soul. The smell of death and destruction was familiar, but what disturbed him was the total absence of signs of normal life. There were no children playing, dogs barking, or any sound indicating this had once been a prosperous community. His trained eyes detected furtive movements behind broken windows and half-open doors, German civilians watching their arrival with fear and curiosity. The texture of the M1 Garand rifle in his hands was warm from the spring sun, but he knew his real weapon at that moment wasn't military force, but the decision of how to treat a defeated and starving population. The sound of his boots on broken glass echoed like the steps of a judge walking toward the final verdict. When the first American patrol turned the corner of the street where Helmut was hiding, time seemed to crystallize in a moment of infinite possibilities. The soldier in front, young, with blonde hair that reminded him of his own son who died in Russia, made direct eye contact with him through the opening where a window used to be. For some endless seconds, starving German man and well-fed American soldier measured each other, each trying to decipher the other's intentions across an abyss created by years of propaganda and war. The smell of American soap, clean, medicinal, civilized, reached Helmet carried by the breeze, an aroma that evoked a world where basic luxuries like regular personal hygiene still existed. The rough texture of his own dirty and torn clothes mentally contrasted with the invaders' impeccable uniforms, reminding him how far he had fallen since the Reich's glory days. In that instant, both men understood they were about to write a page of history that no propaganda had anticipated. The true test of humanity is not in how we treat our friends, but in how we treat our defeated enemies. Then the impossible happened. Sergeant Harris, observing Helmet's cadaverous face and recognizing in it the universal mask of extreme hunger, did something that neither his superiors nor military manuals had anticipated. He removed from his backpack a still-sealed K-ration and a piece of field bread he had saved from breakfast, extending them through the broken window with a simple gesture that reverberated like an emotional earthquake through the starving German's heart. The aroma of fresh bread, yeast, wheat flour, and a pinch of salt hit Helmet's nostrils like a divine revelation, making his salivary glands react so violently that he almost choked on his own saliva. The soft texture of the bread in his trembling hands was so smooth and comforting that he almost cried, a sensation he had completely forgotten during the months of feeding on bark and roots. The sound of the ration package being opened by the American soldier, a simple noise of paper being torn, sounded like heavenly music to ears that had grown accustomed only to echoes of destruction. In that moment, all words about enemies and propaganda disappeared, replaced by the universal language of human compassion. Harris watched the German devour the food with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that surprised him. The sound of Helmet's teeth chewing the bread with desperate voracity echoed strangely in the tense silence of the devastated street, a noise that spoke more about the human condition than any political speech could express. The smell of sweat and desperation emanating from the German civilian now mixed with the aroma of American food, creating an atmosphere of unexpected reconciliation that neither man had anticipated. The texture of the leather on his military belt felt strangely heavy, as Harris reflected on how many similar rations he possessed and how many hungry faces he could feed with them. Other soldiers in his patrol watched the scene with expressions ranging from approval to confusion, some silently questioning the wisdom of feeding the defeated enemy. The distant sound of more American military vehicles approaching reminded everyone that this was just the beginning of an occupation that could last months or years, and that each gesture would shape the future of relations between victors and vanquished. News of Sergeant Harris's gesture spread through the city ruins, with the speed that only good news can achieve in desperate times. Lieselot, still hidden in her basement, heard whispers from other civilians who had witnessed Americans distributing food instead of bullets, information so surreal that she initially dismissed it as collective delirium caused by hunger. The sound of hurried footsteps over the rubble brought echoes of hopeful conversations. German voices discussing in low but animated tones about American soldiers who shared rations and even cigarettes with the civilian population. The smell of the damp basement seemed less oppressive now, as if the possibility of food had altered even her perception of the surrounding odors. Her hands stopped trembling so intensely, and the cold texture of the floor stones no longer seemed so uncomfortable against her knees when she knelt to thank a God who might still care about the defeated. For the first time in months, Lieselot dared to imagine there might be a tomorrow different from the nightmare she was living. When she finally found the courage to leave her hiding place, Lieselot emerged from the basement like a wandering soul returning to the world of the living. The afternoon sun hit her eyes, unaccustomed to light, making her blink repeatedly as she adjusted her vision to the brightness of a spring that continued blooming, even amid total devastation. The sound of American voices speaking English, not shouting military orders, but conversing casually, reached her carried by a breeze that also brought the impossible aroma of hot coffee being prepared somewhere nearby. Her wobbly legs carried her toward the sounds of life, each step a small victory over the fear and despair that had kept her prisoner for so long. The texture of small stones and glass fragments under her bare feet should have hurt her, but the pain was overshadowed by the growing euphoria of discovering that the world hadn't ended completely. When she turned the last corner, and saw with her own eyes American soldiers distributing food to a small line of German civilians, her mind had difficulty processing a reality so different from everything she had been taught to expect. Sergeant Harris, now coordinating an improvised food distribution operation, observed each German face that approached his patrol, with a mixture of military caution and human compassion that defined his complex personality. The sound of cans being opened and packages being torn created a soundtrack of hope that echoed strangely among the ruins of a city that seemed to have forgotten how to sound joyful. The smell of American food, canned meat, hardtack, instant coffee, mixed with the persistent odors of destruction, creating a surreal atmosphere where war and peace seemed to coexist in the same temporal space. The texture of hot metal from his helmet under the afternoon sun reminded him that he was still a soldier in enemy territory. But the grateful faces of German civilians were rapidly redefining what it meant to be an enemy. Each shy smile, each word of gratitude murmured in broken German with some English words, each gesture of desperate reverence transformed invaders into liberators and enemies into human beings who shared the most basic need of all, eating to survive one more day. Hunger doesn't recognize uniforms, and compassion knows no borders. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary began to flourish among Frankfurt's rubble, a kind of improvised community where American soldiers and German civilians learned to see each other beyond the uniforms and propaganda that had separated them for years. Helmet, now with renewed strength thanks to the regular rations he received, became an informal bridge between the two worlds, translating not just words, but gestures and intentions that transcended language barriers. The sound of German children laughing for the first time in months, mixed with the English calls of soldiers, creating an urban symphony that spoke of reconstruction and hope, where before there had been only silence and despair. The smell of hot soup being prepared in American Army cauldrons gradually replaced the persistent aroma of destruction, bringing back memories of normalcy that seemed to have been buried forever under the rubble. The rough texture of Helmet's hands, calloused from debris removal work alongside American soldiers, told a story of cooperation that even he hadn't imagined possible just a month before. Lieselotte discovered in herself a strength she didn't know she possessed when she volunteered to help in the improvised kitchen that the Americans had set up in the town's old school. Her hands, which had trembled from hunger and fear, now worked with renewed purpose, peeling American potatoes and preparing stews that fed both soldiers and civilians. The rhythmic sound of their knives cutting vegetables echoed along with the low laughter of other German women, who had also found purpose in the task of nourishing those who had chosen to nourish them first. The smell of onions sautéing in American oil made her eyes water, but these were tears of relief and gratitude, not despair like in previous months. The familiar texture of ingredients between her fingers brought back memories of when she cooked for Klaus, but now without the piercing pain of loss, replaced by a sense of continuity she thought she had lost forever. When Sergeant Harris greeted her in hesitant German, "Guten Tag, Frau Brandt," she responded in equally hesitant English, "Good morning, Sergeant," and both smiled at the imperfection that made them more human. Sergeant Harris himself discovered that feeding former enemies was more satisfying than defeating them in battle, a revelation that surprised him and made him question many of the certainties he had brought from America. The letters he wrote to his wife in Kansas began to include descriptions of German children who learned to say thank you, and of old men who removed tattered hats to greet him on the reconstructed streets. The sound of hammers pounding in house reconstruction, Germans and Americans working side by side, replaced the echoing of shots and explosions that had soundtracked his journey across Europe. The smell of new wood being cut and fresh paint being applied began to mask the persistent odors of war, creating an atmosphere of renewal that infected even the most skeptical soldiers in his unit. The texture of shared tools, Germans using American hammers, Americans using German saws, symbolized cooperation that transcended politics and was based on the fundamental human need to rebuild what had been destroyed. When he received reports from other sectors of the city about incidents between occupiers and occupied, Harris took pride in being able to report that in his area. Former enemies had become partners in the Herculean task of bringing life back to a dead city. As April turned to May and May promised to become June, the faces around the community kitchen changed from spectral to human, from hopeless to cautiously optimistic. Helmut discovered that his ability to translate between German and English gave him an importance he hadn't felt since before the war, and he began teaching basic English to German children who played around the improvised American base. The sound of children's voices repeating apple, bread, thank you, in heavy German accents echoed through the streets like a promise that the next generations wouldn't inherit only the hatreds of the previous one. The smell of American chalk on small portable blackboards that soldiers had improvised, mixed with the aroma of wildflowers beginning to sprout among the rubble, signs that life found its way even through pulverized concrete. The smooth texture of pages from English books that Harris had brought from his personal library contrasted with the roughness of German children's hands that leafed through them with reverence, each page representing a window to a future different from the past their parents had known. Lieselotte, watching those small improvised lessons while preparing dinner, understood that she was witnessing something historic, not just the end of a war, but the birth of a peace that grew from the bottom up, built upon simple gestures of shared humanity. Her hands, now steady and purposeful, worked with ingredients that came from both American stocks and improvised gardens that German civilians had planted on vacant lots left by the bombings. The sound of mixed conversations, German and English intertwined in phrases that created a new language of reconciliation, provided the soundtrack for meals that nourished more than hungry bodies, but souls wounded by war. The smell of food being served to soldiers and civilians at the same improvised table symbolized something no peace treaty could legislate: the mutual recognition of shared humanity that survives any conflict. The texture of wood from the common table where Americans and Germans ate together, scratched by war, but still solid enough to support the weight of shared plates, served as a metaphor for the civilization they were rebuilding one meal at a time. When enemies share the same bread, they stop being enemies to become simply hungry people who found food together. As June advanced over the reconstructed ruins of Frankfurt, a new and unlikely routine was established among those who had been enemies just 2 months before. Helmut woke every morning to the sound of the American Reveille, no longer as prisoner of an occupation, but as partner in a reconstruction project that took shape each day. The smell of American coffee mixed with the aroma of German bread baked in improvised ovens created a morning atmosphere that symbolized the emerging cultural fusion between victors and vanquished. His hands, now steady and well-nourished, worked alongside soldiers from Kansas and Texas removing rubble that would give way to a new school for neighborhood children. The rough texture of broken bricks he carried no longer hurt his palms like in the early days. Calluses that had developed not from privation, but from dignified work performed in partnership with men who had chosen to build instead of simply conquer. The sound of pickaxes and shovels working in coordinated rhythm echoed through the streets like a symphony of hope, punctuated by German and American voices that had learned to communicate through a creative mixture of words, gestures, and smiles. Lieselotte discovered that teaching German cooking to curious American soldiers was a more effective form of diplomacy than any official treaty, a cultural exchange that happened naturally around the improvised stoves of the community kitchen. Corporal Johnson, a young man from Georgia who missed his grandmother's food, learned to prepare sauerbraten with the same dedication with which she learned to make American cornbread, both laughing at their mistakes and celebrating small culinary successes. The smell of traditional German spices, juniper, bay leaf, and clove, mixed with the aromas of American seasonings that soldiers had brought from home, creating a gastronomic fusion that told a story of mutual acceptance. The texture of bread doughs they kneaded together, German and American, traditional and innovative, symbolized how different cultures could blend without losing their essential identities. The sound of pots bubbling and ovens crackling provided the soundtrack for conversations that transcended language differences, where family recipes became bridges between worlds that war had separated. When Lieselotte saw American soldiers serving German stew to local children, she understood she was witnessing a silent revolution based on the transformative power of shared food. Sergeant Harris, observing these small daily miracles from his position as informal commander of the reconstruction operation, began documenting in his personal diary the unexpected lessons this experience was teaching him about human nature and leadership. His notes described how Johnny Mueller, an 8-year-old German boy who had lost his father in the war, taught American baseball to soldiers who had never held a bat, while learning English words he would use for the rest of his life. The smell of leather from baseball mitts mixed with the aroma of wildflowers growing among the rubble created an atmosphere of normalcy that contrasted dramatically with combat memories that still visited him in dreams. The texture of paper on which he wrote his observations, rough, military, practical, carried words that documented a transformation that surpassed any tactical victory he had achieved on French battlefields. The sound of children's laughter echoing among reconstructed buildings replaced in his memory the echoes of artillery and war cries, creating a soundtrack of peace that he knew he would carry home to Kansas. Each page of his diary recorded not just events, but the evolution of his own understanding of what it meant to be a soldier in peacetime, a conqueror who had chosen to build instead of simply dominate. The deepest transformations, however, happened in nighttime conversations around improvised campfires, where personal stories were shared in a mixture of German, English, and the universal language of shared human experience. Helmut discovered that Sergeant Harris had lost a brother at Omaha Beach, while Harris learned that Helmut had lost 2 sons, one in Russia, another in Frankfurt's bombings. The smell of burning wood mixed with the aroma of American and German tobacco created an intimate atmosphere where old pains could be expressed and understood by men who had been on opposite sides of the same tragedy. The rough texture of stones around the fire where they sat symbolized the hardness of experiences that had shaped their lives, but the warmth of flames represented the possibility of healing that emerged from mutual recognition of loss. The sound of low voices narrating painful memories, punctuated by crackling fire and sighs of understanding, created a secular liturgy of reconciliation that no church or government could have orchestrated. When tears were shed, American and German, equally salted by war's pain, they irrigated the emotional soil where true peace began to germinate. Lieselot, watching these scenes from her position in the kitchen where she prepared hot tea for men around the fire, understood she was witnessing something that future history books might never adequately record. The small daily reconciliations, an American soldier helping an elderly German woman carry water, a German child teaching a traditional song to homesick soldiers, a wounded German veteran teaching carpentry techniques to young Americans, built a more solid peace than any international treaty could guarantee. The smell of medicinal herbs she added to tea, German chamomile grown in her small, improvised garden, mixed with the aroma of American sugar, creating a drink that symbolized the beneficial fusion of different traditions. The texture of mismatched cups, some German survivors of bombings, others American brought by soldiers, in her hands represented how broken things could be mended and foreign things could become familiar. The sound of satisfied sighs when men drank her hot tea after nights of difficult conversations provided her with a sense of purpose she had lost when Klaus died, proving that even war widows could find new ways to nurture and heal. Each cup served was a small act of domestic diplomacy that contributed to building a peace that grew from the bottom up, one drop of understanding at a time. Great historical reconciliations are built upon thousands of small gestures of kindness between ordinary people. Not everyone looked favorably upon the transformation taking place in Frankfurt's reconstructed streets, and Helmut discovered this in the worst possible way when he found a threatening note nailed to the door of his improvised home, accusing him of being a collaborator traitor to the German people. The yellowed paper trembled in his hands not from fear, but from indignation, at knowing there were still those who preferred to feed hatred instead of accepting food offered generously by former enemies. The smell of cheap ink used to write the poisonous words mixed with the morning aroma of American coffee coming from the community kitchen, creating an olfactory contrast that symbolized the tension between past and future, competing for the German soul. The rough texture of paper between his fingers seemed to carry all the weight of Nazi propaganda that still infected minds refusing to accept that the world had changed, that old certainties had been destroyed along with bombed cities. The sound of voices whispering in dark corners, disgruntled Germans organizing resistance not against military occupation, but against the occupation of compassion, echoed like persistent echo of a war some refused to let end. Helmut understood in that moment that true peace would have its own enemies, and that not all Germans were ready to accept that humanity was not synonymous with weakness. Sergeant Harris faced his own battles when he received orders from his superiors questioning the excessive fraternization with German civilian population, a policy some commanders considered harmful to military discipline and potentially dangerous to troop security. The smell of official paper and military ink from correspondence arriving from higher echelons contrasted bitterly with the aroma of hot bread his community kitchen produced daily, symbolizing the conflict between military bureaucracy and human reality on the ground. The rigid texture of military regulations he was supposed to follow seemed increasingly inadequate to deal with the emotional complexity of an occupation that had transformed into reconstruction partnership. The sound of military boots marching in formation, soldiers from other units who maintained strict distance from German civilians, echoed as constant reminder that his approach was exception, not rule, in official occupation policy. His hands sweated as he wrote reports trying to explain to distant commanders how feeding former enemies had become more effective at maintaining peace than armed patrols and curfews. Harris discovered that defending humanity within a military structure required a different courage from that needed on battlefields, a political bravery few soldiers were called upon to demonstrate. Lieselot felt the weight of disapproval when other German women, those who had lost husbands, sons and brothers to Allied forces, confronted her accusing her of disrespecting the memory of German dead by cooking for American soldiers. The smell of cheap perfume and resentment emanating from these bitter women mixed unpleasantly with the aroma of soup she prepared, creating a toxic atmosphere that made her question whether she was betraying Klaus by finding purpose in feeding his former enemies. The rough texture of judgmental looks she received when walking through reconstructed streets seemed sharper than any glass fragment she had stepped on during bombings, wounding a part of her soul she thought had healed. The sound of malicious whispers following her. Ami Liebchen murmured with contempt. Hoarse spat in mispronounced English, echoed in her ears as constant reminder that not all Germans were ready to forgive or be forgiven. Her hands trembled again, not from hunger, but from existential doubt about whether choosing life instead of bitterness was really the right decision. Every pot she washed, every ingredient she cut, every smile she offered to American soldiers became an act of rebellion against those who preferred to preserve wounds instead of allowing them to heal. The situation reached its critical point when a group of radical Germans, led by a former SS officer who had escaped capture, organized a nighttime attack against the community kitchen, not to steal food, but to destroy the symbol of cultural contamination it represented. The smell of gasoline poured over tables where Germans and Americans ate together, mixed with the persistent aroma of burned food, creating an atmosphere of violence that contrasted brutally with the harmony that had been so carefully built. The sticky texture of flammable fuel dripping over the woods of improvised construction symbolized how hatred could destroy in minutes what compassion had built in months of patient work. The sound of glass being deliberately broken, not by war but by refusal to accept peace, echoed like sacrilege against everything Helmut, Lieselot, and Harris had achieved together. When they arrived in the morning and found their work of reconciliation reduced to smoking rubble, the three understood that building peace was more dangerous than making war, because it required confronting not just external enemies, but internal demons that fed the human need to hate. The charred paper of a drawing that a German child had made showing American and German soldiers playing together floated among the ashes like epitaph of innocence destroyed by adults who refused to grow beyond their resentments. But it was in the response to this destruction that the true strength of the improvised community was revealed. Instead of giving up or allowing fear to separate them again, Helmut, Lieselotte, Harris, and hundreds of others, Germans and Americans united by shared experience of building something beautiful, appeared the next morning with tools, materials, and renewed determination to rebuild what had been destroyed. The smell of new wood mixed with the persistent aroma of ashes created an atmosphere of rebirth that seemed more powerful than the destruction that had preceded it, proving that creation always overcame destruction when fed by collective will. The texture of intertwined hands, German and American working together to raise new beams, told a story of resistance not against occupation, but against those trying to prevent reconciliation. The sound of hammers beating in coordinated rhythm, punctuated by laughter of determination and words of encouragement in two languages, created a symphony of defense of humanity that echoed louder than any national anthem. When the sun set over the new community kitchen, larger, more solid and more beautiful than the previous one, everyone present understood they had won a battle different from any the war had offered. The battle for civilization's soul, proving that goodness was stronger than hatred, and that shared humanity was more powerful than any propaganda trying to divide them. The true test of peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of courage to rebuild when others choose to destroy. When August arrived bringing transfer orders that would separate Sergeant Harris's unit from Frankfurt, the approaching farewell carried an emotional weight none of those involved had anticipated. The letters Helmut wrote to Kansas addresses, trying to maintain contact with men who had been his enemies and became his friends, were written with handwriting that trembled not from weakness, but from contained emotion at the possibility that this unique experience could be lost in time. The smell of fresh ink mixed with the aroma of flowers now growing abundantly in improvised gardens between reconstructed buildings created an atmosphere of continuity that transcended the imminent departure of American soldiers. The texture of paper where he documented names, addresses, and promises of future correspondence seemed more precious than any official document he had signed in his life, because it carried the weight of friendships born from necessity and grown in mutual understanding. The sound of voices practicing English and German, soldiers and civilians exchanging final language lessons, echoed through the streets like preparation for a separation everyone knew was necessary, but no one wanted to face. Helmut understood he had become witness to something that needed to be preserved, a story that should be told so future generations would know that even in the most brutal wars, humanity could flourish in the most unexpected places. Lieselot discovered that her small recipe notebook had become a diplomatic treasure, pages where German and American dishes were documented side by side, ingredients and techniques mixed in a culinary fusion that told the story of cultures learning to complement rather than combat each other. The smell of dried spices pressed between pages, German cinnamon and Hungarian paprika, mixed with American cayenne pepper and Canadian maple syrup, created an aroma that would forever be associated in her memory with the most hopeful month she had lived since Klaus's death. The smooth texture of pages worn by constant use carried much more than recipes. It carried tangible proof that enemies could become family, that cultural differences could be celebrated instead of feared. The sound of pots being packed and ovens being dismantled echoed like demolition of something sacred. But she knew the true legacy of the community kitchen wasn't in the equipment, but in hearts and minds that had been transformed by the experience of nourishing and being nourished. When she handed a handwritten copy of her recipes to each departing soldier, Lieselot was distributing much more than culinary instructions. She was sending to America pieces of the German soul that had learned to trust again in human goodness. Sergeant Harris faced departure with a mixture of military pride and personal melancholy that defined his complex nature as soldier and humanitarian. His final entries in his personal diary documented not tactical victories or territorial conquests, but faces of German children who had learned to play baseball, names of families who had rebuilt their homes with American help, and addresses of Germans he promised to visit when life returned to normal. The smell of military leather from his equipment mixed with the aroma of personal letters he carried from grateful German civilians created an atmosphere of farewell that transcended military protocols and touched deep regions of his Kansas farmer's soul. The texture of metals on his chest seemed less important than the sensation of German hands he had shaken, backs he had helped carry construction materials, children he had taught to pronounce English words. The sound of truck engines warming up for departure mixed with farewell calls in German and English, creating a soundtrack of separation that would echo in his memory for decades. Harris knew he would return home with an understanding about war and peace that no military academy could have taught. Carrying in his emotional baggage proof that soldiers could be builders and enemies could become teachers of the most important lessons about human nature, as the last American trucks disappeared on the horizon, leaving behind a Frankfurt that had been physically reconstructed and emotionally transformed. The Germans who remained carried with them something more valuable than repaired buildings or fed stomachs. Helmut watched children playing in spaces that had been created by cooperation between former enemy nations, understanding that those children would grow up with an understanding about the possibility of reconciliation that their own generations had discovered too late. The smell of fresh paint on newly painted walls of reconstructed houses, mixed with the aroma of bread baking in ovens that American soldiers had helped repair, creating an atmosphere of continuity that proved some transformations survive the people who initiate them. The texture of shared tools, some German, others American, all used together to build something new, remained in the calloused hands of those who learned that cooperation was more effective than competition. The sound of conversations where German and English words mixed naturally echoed as evidence that linguistic boundaries, like national boundaries, were artificial constructions that could be transcended by human will to connect. Each garden that flourished between reconstructed buildings, each family that ate at tables repaired with American wood and German nails, each child who knew how to say thank you in 2 languages, represented a victory against those who believed cultural differences were incompatible by nature. Years later, when historians would try to explain how West Germany had become such a close ally of the United States, despite the brutality of the war that had separated them, some would mention political treaties and economic agreements, but few would adequately document stories like Frankfurt's, small miracles of shared humanity that happened in hundreds of German cities where American soldiers chose to feed instead of simply occupy. The smell of flowers growing in cemeteries, where American and German soldiers rested side by side, mixed with the aroma of incense burned in churches where prayers were offered in English and German for those who had died and those who had survived to build something better. The texture of stones from monuments erected not to celebrate military victories, but to remember moments of compassion and reconciliation, told a different story of war, a story where heroes weren't just those who killed enemies, but those who transformed enemies into friends. The sound of bells ringing in reconstructed churches echoed, as celebration not just of war's end, but of the beginning of a peace that had grown from the bottom up, built upon thousands of small gestures of kindness between ordinary people who discovered that humanity was stronger than propaganda. When Helmut, now old, told his grandchildren about the day American soldiers shared bread with starving Germans, he always ended the story with the same phrase. And that's how we learned that hunger has no nationality, and compassion knows no borders. Lessons you must remember forever. The true victory of a war is not in defeating enemies, but in transforming enemies into friends, proving that humanity is stronger than any hatred that tries to divide it.